developments and the short-term outlook. Growth has clearly lost momentum compared to 6 months ago, compared to when we last met during the annual meetings. Some loss of momentum was, of course, to be expected, considering that growth had been above potential in most countries for a while, considering that the recovery was getting quite mature. Nonetheless, we have been surprised about the speed of the slowdown. What we are seeing is clearly more than a normal mid-cycle cooling. Still, and this is important for our policy recommendations, which I will get to in a minute, we expect growth to gradually recover during 2019. This is partly because some of the sharp slowdown was due to temporary factors. For instance, as you know, relating to the automobile industry in Germany, factors that are expected and that are already unwinding. Furthermore, we expect that domestic demand will be supported by still strong labor markets. The good news here is that employment and wages are still going up in most labor markets. But domestic demand is also said to be supported by lower oil prices, they're quite notably lower compared to last year, and by supportive policies. Moreover, we forecast global trade and thus European exports to re-accelerate from where we are. Clearly, there are important downside risks. You are familiar with them, notably from the intensification of trade tensions and a still uncertain Brexit outcome, although the fact that a cliff-edge Brexit has been avoided for now is certainly a welcome development. These risks are already weighing on sentiments. Still, on the strengths of these aforementioned factors underpinning in particular domestic demand, our baseline forecast is, as I said, for a gradual recovery from the sharp slowdown seen in the last 6 months. What does this mean for individual countries and groups of countries? The slowdown has been particularly pronounced in Germany and Italy. Both countries have relatively large manufacturing sectors and thus were hit harder by the global trade slowdown. We have revised down our forecast of real GDP growth in Germany to 0.8% in 2019 and to 0.1%, close to zero, in Italy. This is in both cases about 1 percentage point lower relative to what we estimated 6 months ago. We now forecast growth in Germany next year to increase to 1.4 and Italy to go back up, reaching 0.9 in 2020. So no further increase in 2020 compared to 2019. Activity elsewhere in the Eurozone slowed to a lesser extent than in Italy and Germany. For the Eurozone as a whole, we have revised down growth this year to 1.3%. That's a revision by 0.6% compared to 6 months ago. And we expect growth in the Eurozone as a whole of 1.5% in next year. The UK economy has seen a growth slows to 1.2% this year. This is a 0.3% downward revision. This is a result of an appreciable slowdown in investment due to the uncertainty about Brexit. Clearly, a well-managed Brexit that minimizes trade barriers, which is what we assume in our forecast, should lower uncertainty and thus support investment and growth. I repeat, this is what we have built into our baseline forecast for the UK. Activity in emerging Europe, excluding Turkey and Russia, we have it unchanged at 3.3% this year, unchanged compared to what we assumed 6 months ago. Now, with that outlook, as I just described it, let me turn to the policy implications. First, let me make a general point. You will recall that for a while we have been stressing that several countries that need to build more fiscal space, those that need to reduce fiscal deficit and public indebtedness, these countries, several of these countries, were not taking sufficient advantage of the strong economic growth in recent years to do so. Considering that we expect a gradual recovery in 2019 and around potential growth in 2020, you would therefore not be surprised that we are calling on governments in countries that need to build fiscal space to do so. That is, to focus fiscal policy firmly on medium-term objectives of gradual fiscal consolidation. Discretionary fiscal policy is simply too blunt and slow a tool to be used to fine-tune the economy. This is the job of monetary policy, except in the case of severe negative shocks, in which case there clearly is a role for active fiscal policy. But this is not what we are seeing. We are not seeing such a shock. Yes, there are some notable risks out there, and they need to be very closely watched. But in the meantime, countries should keep the powder dry and focus on building fiscal space if needed. A word here on the Eurozone, where the issue of fiscal space is particularly important because countries do not have an independent monetary policy to offset country-specific shocks. The member countries with relatively high debt, like France, like Italy, like Spain, made only limited progress in reducing debt during the prolonged recovery. We think it's particularly important that they keep fiscal policy focused on medium-term objectives of securing a steady reduction in fiscal deficit and public debt through fiscal structural adjustment. As we have said before, this can be done while safeguarding social protection and giving the private sector incentives to grow. At the same time, this is important, we continue to see a case for Eurozone countries that have fiscal space, like Germany, to increase spending or cut taxes to help boost potential growth. Doing so would also help some countries to reduce what is still very large current account surpluses. I should know, however, that the main reason for the large current account surpluses in these countries is that wages are adjusting too slowly to the decline in unemployment. The increase in real incomes and attendant reduction in competitiveness that before the euro would have come to appreciation of the currency now need to come in these countries through an increase in nominal wages. We hope that the acceleration in wages in countries like Germany that became evident last year will continue. Finally, a few remarks on Central and Eastern Europe. We were previously, and we have discussed this before, increasingly concerned that several countries were pursuing highly pro-cyclical policies and that this threatened to force a premature tightening of monetary policy so that the policy mix would become sort of unfavorable and crowd out investments to higher interest rates prematurely. Clearly, with a slowdown in Eastern Europe and in new member states, Central Eastern Europe, we are less concerned about that at this stage. That being said, governments in these countries will need to ensure that make efficient use of the still relatively good times to lower fiscal deficit and rebuild room for fiscal policy maneuvers in the future. A word on structural reforms. I'm almost at the end. Structural reforms in Europe, East-West, remains a critical priority. Structural reform to increase resilience and ensure income convergence. With very few exceptions, there are some exceptions, but with very few exceptions, we have witnessed a renewed increase in convergence gap between Europe and the US, and within the Eurozone between the North and the South. Reforms to foster innovation and the diffusion of new technology would be beneficial. Other needed reforms include product market measures to increase the flexibility of markets and corporate insolvency reforms to allow a better functioning of financial markets. Okay, let me stop here and happy to take your questions.
Please identify yourselves and your affiliation before starting. I'll start with Jan. This one, the microphone.
Yes. Thank you. Jan Böscher from German Public Radio. Regarding your policy advice for Germany, the finance minister of Germany this morning said there's a kind of a misunderstanding. Critics of Germany wouldn't see all the efforts they do, tax reductions and more public spending, and he said there will be more investments in the future about new cars or energy investments. So is the IMF not seeing what Germany is doing in regarding of spending?
So I think it's a good question, and I understand the minister's remark. Indeed, Germany, the German budget for 2019 entail, in our estimation, a structural fiscal relaxation of 0.7% of GDP, and that is a notable one. I agree with that. Our argument is that, looking forward, given the fiscal space Germany has, we can, over several years, see a sustained increase in reforms that could boost spending. So I would agree with the minister. Germany is doing relatively well this year, but we need to see more and keep it coming.
Thank you. This is Lena Argyri with Greek Public TV. Do you think that Greece should proceed with the partial repayment of the so-called expensive IMF loans? Do you agree with this strategy? Thank you.
So I would welcome that. IMF resources are supposed to be temporary. We are supposed to provide our resources for countries that temporarily need them, and there are incentives to build in to ensure early repayments if the country's situation allow this. So I would welcome that. Yeah.
In your latest post-program monitoring report, you have argued the Greek government to proceed and fix the Greek bank problems. Do you, especially those problems that have to do with the non-performing loans, do you believe that the Greek banks will need fresh capital in the foreseeable future? And do you believe that the Greek banking system still poses fiscal risk? Thank you.
So, if there are any other questions on Greece, let's get them now. Okay.
Hi, Petros Kasfikis from Athens News Agency. Do you believe that the reduction of income tax-free threshold in Greece in 2020, is it a necessary and inevitable measure?
Okay. First, on the last question on taxes, I do think that the reforms that were agreed, both the pension reforms and the tax reforms, are critically important. Not in order to allow Greece to meet these deficit targets. I think Greece has shown that it can and will meet these targets. As you know, we actually think these targets are pretty ambitious. No, it is order to free up resources that allow Greece to modernize its economy, that allow Greece to invest, that allows Greece to do tax-friendly tax reform, that allow Greece to restore many public spending, much of the public spending that has been compressed to exceptionally low level during the crisis, to such low level where it sort of impairs the public sector's ability to provide basic services that to allow that to recover. We think Greece have done extremely well in terms of fiscal consolidation, but we also think over a number of years that has been achieved through a fiscal policy mix that is growth unfriendly. And the measures that were agreed was an attempt to sort of restore some of the growth friendliness to these measures. The second question was on, sorry? On the banking system, yes. So, we are not involved in a program relationship with Greece. We have nowhere close to the information on or the dialogue that would allow me to answer questions, specific questions about capital needs in Greek banking system. We do not have that. But let me say, we have for a long time said that it's critical in light of the still exceptionally high level of NPLs and the large share of deferred tax liability in the capital, that Greece get a strategy for the banking system that is a credible strategy to allow an early cleaning up of the banking system, strengthen balance sheets that allow the Greek banking system to lend and support the economy. We do not believe that it's credible to have a strategy that sort of assumes that over many, many years the Greek banking systems slowly try to reduce their NPLs. So supervisors need to get ahead of that problem. Whether they are or not, I have no ability to assess because we are not involved in that discussion. Okay, let's move beyond Greece.
Thank you. Gianluca Di Francesco with Il Sole 24 Ore. Two questions. Italy is planning to boost spending and cut taxes, and debt and deficit are not going down. So I'd like to to know what is your opinion about that. The second is on the sovereign and financial sector nexus. In the Global Financial Stability Report, you stress that the situation in Italy is worrying in this context. I'd like to know how much is worrying, in your opinion, and something about the risk of spillover in the Eurozone. Thank you.
Okay, Italy. So clearly, Italy faces some difficult challenges. We agree with the government that the overarching challenge facing Italy is to implement structural reforms to overcome Italy's low productivity and high structural unemployment. That is the overarching and the social problems associated with this low productivity. That is the main challenge. I agree with that, and this call for structural reforms, and this is obviously sort of a longer-term project. The more immediate challenge facing Italy is, of course, arising from Italy's high public debt and its limited fiscal space. As we discussed at length, and you can see that in our report during the Article 4, a slowdown like the one we are seeing now will present policymakers with a very difficult trade-off between having to take measures, fiscal measures, that to prevent an increase in already high debt, and on the other hand, preventing that such pro-cyclical measures on the way down exacerbate the slowdown. That's a very difficult situation to be in. We believe that it's critical that Italy adopts a medium-term package of gradual fiscal consolidation, gradual measures to achieve a gradual consolidation over the medium term. We believe if these are good measures, if these are credible measures, we think even that in the short run they might not have any significant, if negative, if any, impact on growth if they are measures that sort of helps restore or improve confidence. On the Italian banking system, I have no specific comments. Again, we do not have. We in the European Department do not have the kind of information that would allow me to have a particularly nuanced view on that. We know what the challenges are. The challenge is to continue to bring down NPLs. Italy has made notable progress on that. The challenges is to reduce also exposures over the longer run. to the sovereign in some cases. But I have no specific comments on the challenges facing Italian banks. Again, what we see is, for instance, that they have made significant progress on NPL through market-based measures, particularly the two largest banks, and I think this is very welcome.
Let's stay on Italy here in the first row, please. Stefania.
Stefania Spatti, Radio Call. When the IMF asks Italy concrete and credible measures, can you actually elaborate more and tell us what do you really expect? And also, when you look at the country, are you expecting a sort of confrontation between the Italian authorities and the European one once again when it comes to the public finances?
It's on the measures. There are a number of issues. Clearly, I mean, to begin with, we urge not to roll back the pension reforms. I think that is particularly important. We also know we have had strong reservations, as you know, about some of the tax reforms that we have seen out there. Although I should stress while we are concerned about the proposal on a flat income tax, we do not have sufficient details to really assess it. But clearly, this is before we talk about what Italy should do to improve its fiscal situation. Let's be sure that we don't backtrack in a number of areas. On the relations with the Commission, it's not for me to speculate about. I am of course encouraged about that the last time around, after some disagreement, they found a compromise. Italy has limited fiscal space, and I think I'm confident that the Italian authorities and the Commission will find a right way forward.
Hello, Voice of America Armenian Service on Armenia. After Velvet Revolution last year, there were a lot of talks and fight against corruption. So what are your expectations now from Armenia? What's your advice to the government, and do you plan to enlarge?
So what country are we talking about?
Armenia.
Armenia? Armenia is not part of the European Department, so I'll have to pass on that. I would be accused of a power grab if I started answering that question.
Barry, please.
Barry Wood,
Hi, Barry.
RTHK in Hong Kong, and a writer on Eastern Europe. 18 months ago, you said that the progress in Eastern Europe had been astonishing since the transition. What's your latest assessment of the reforms in the Baltic, Central Europe, and the Balkans by region in terms of the prospects of convergence with the West?
I think that my assessment would by and large be the same. I think Eastern Europe is clearly a bright spot. We are seeing still relatively robust growth. Potential growth is lower than it used to be than before the crisis. But it's to some extent not surprising. I mean, some of sort of low-hanging fruit in terms of that were picked in the first 25 years are no longer there. So it's going to be more and more difficult as you get closer to continue to have significant catch-up gain in productivity. The issues are more complex. It's more like institutional reforms. So, but I am no, I am generally optimistic from what I see. One of the key challenges is clearly that they've been doing so well that in many places they are running into severe constraints in the labor markets, so one set of challenges is clearly to increase labor market participation and to through education and training to increase skills. Also, but you know, I think Eastern Europe is a bright spot, and the convergence sort of problems I talked to before, we do still see convergence, although slower, as I said, to be expected, between Eastern Europe and Western Europe.
Yes, thank you. Ivo Puljic, Al Jazeera Balkans, then Western Balkans obviously is my topic, and how will you elaborate this situation in Western Balkans countries? But please, second question is connected with Bosnia and Herzegovina. I met yesterday two delegations that totally separated, politically speaking, from two entities. Is that big impact on economy and contacts with you guys in IMF? And I was told that from one of them that Bosnia and Herzegovina practically doesn't need IMF anymore. Thank you.
That's good. If a country does not need us, that's no, but can implement the necessary programs without our assistance. I think that's we should welcome that. As you know, we do have a program with Bosnia Herzegovina. It's a program that so the authorities clearly think there's a reason for staying involved with the IMF. It's a program that is it's off track in the sense that there are a number of issues out there that need to be resolved before we can disperse again. But I think this shows that the authorities do think that being in an active dialogue with the fund, that the fund program can help catalyze the right policies. So, no, if that's the case, we're happy to be involved.
Chesco Roberto from TV3 Spain. You expect a recovery in the Eurozone next year, slight recovery, but in Spain you forecast from 2.1 this year to 1.9 next year. So why Spain is against this trend? And also I think on your report you say that the unemployment rate in Spain basically will be flattened during the next years, around 15–14%, but we won't go below that. So why you are such pessimistic in that unemployment rate? Thank you.
Well, I think the simple answer is that I don't have all the numbers here, but we have not revised Spain downward that much compared to the rest of the countries. No, Spain has for a while, in our estimation, and I think in the estimation of the Spanish authorities, operated above potential. So you do expect this gradual slowdown. Over time.
Hello, from El País in Spain too. I don't know if you have taken into account the elections at the end of this month, in which the most likely result is again either a hung parliament or a very weak government, which makes it difficult to do the reforms that seem to be needed. I don't know if you have taken into account and what could this already long period of uncertainty or difficulty for policy making could mean for Spain.
So we have Spain is one of the countries where for a number of years we have been too conservative and where we have constantly revised upward our projections, reflecting the strengths of the structural reforms that were implemented in the wake of the crisis or during the crisis, not least the labor market reforms. and we have continued to see significant payoffs of these reforms. So, and I'm coming to answer your question. Our fundamental assumption is that these reforms stay in place, and that they are not that there's no backtracking on these reforms, particularly labor market reforms. And I think that's a critical assumption. We do hope that we certainly see a case for continuing reforms. We do think that there is still issues in the labor market, the duality in the labor market, and one should have labor market reforms. But our projections for Spain do not, at this stage, build in any sort of significant further intensification of reform. But it assumes that there is a political support for continuing the reforms.
Özlem Tınaz, VOA Turkish. First of all, where do we see the Turkish economy is? Turkey has a close relations with IMF. And the second question...
so can you say the first question on Turkey was?
Where the Turkish economy is in the world economy. And the second question, Turkey announced a new reform program. Do you believe that Turkey achieved these goals? Thank you.
Any other questions on Turkey?
Paul Michael Gardiou from Open TV. Almost all the economists and all the analysts, they agree that the Turkish economy is going to collapse in the summer. And I wanted to know what is your take on this, because I saw in one of your reports that you cover them.
So look, I would not agree with the way you describe it. I don't think that everybody expects a collapse of the Turkish economy. We certainly do not. Yes, Turkey is facing some challenge at the moment, and yes, we do think that Turkey will go through a period, will have a recession, if you want, with some reduction in GDP. So the fact is that sort of the political and financial turmoil that we've seen have taken a toll on the economy. So but we should sort of not exaggerate the difficulties Turkey are facing. What are they? Clearly, Turkey has taken some important measures during the last 6 months, including on monetary policy. I think it is critical that first that Turkey maintain an appropriately tight monetary policy to reduce inflation and re-anchor inflationary expectation. There has been progress. It is critically important that the central bank is being given the independence that it will allow it to, in a forward-looking manner, as circumstances change, maintain this appropriately tight monetary policy. So central bank independence is critically important in that regard. On fiscal policy, Turkey actually has fiscal space, and we certainly would recommend that Turkey can allow automatic stabilizers to work as it goes into this more difficult period. I think some of the critical issues facing Turkey here is sort of around the issue of transparency, relating to PPPs, relating to quasi-fiscal operations. And third, clearly, with this relatively significant downturn, it's, as always, important to keep a close watch on the financial sector and take actions if needed. And I think particularly to reform the insolvency and restructuring framework to deal with any problems that might arise. Let me stress, it's important. No, I have said what we think are the challenges facing Turkey. That is, you can find these views in our Article 4 reports. It's a reflection of our normal discussion in an Article 4 context. There is no discussion between Turkey and the IMF officially behind the scene or anything like that beyond the normal surveillance discussion. It's all in the context of normal surveillance, and yeah, I think that's Turkey.
Time for 2 more questions. Please, the lady with the yellow shirt in the back.
Branka Slavica, Croatian Public Television. My question is on Croatia. Can you please talk a little bit about the IMF's forecast for Croatia, which is only slightly different than the previous one? The fund's recommendations for Croatia, which obviously doesn't have a robust growth. Thank you.
Croatia. You know, I would have to get back to you on the details of our projections because I can, I can just not remember. But I would happy after here. I just need to check on. I have too many countries in the department to remember the details for individual countries. So let's talk after.
Last question for Michael here, please. Yeah, Eva.
Hi, Michael Donhauser, German press agency.
Mm-hmm.
You did talk a little bit about wages in countries like Germany, which could be higher in order to get the trade balance in order. Do you think the wages are too low in Germany, and how could they, if yes, how could they be increased?
So I think it's, as I said, if a country with such a strong current account position would in the past obviously have seen an appreciation of the currency, and that would have increased real incomes. Since we don't have this mechanism now, we have to rely on nominal wages. I of course fully mindful of the fact that Germany has a system for determination of wages where the government has no role. So it is it's a challenge. I think what we need is for the labor markets partners to get to agreements that entail higher wages. I understand that in the past, labor market, labor has been perhaps more concerned about job security, preserving jobs, than about wages. But I would hope, as we go to, as we see that that the economy is performing very well, and that there is significant employment opportunities, that the strong labor market conditions translate into higher wages. So we recognized, particularly in the German system, where we have sort of multi-year labor contracts, that could take some time. And that is clearly one of the reasons why it will take some time for the current account to come down. But I am hopeful that we will see, in light of the strong labor market condition, that German wages start responding more forcefully.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to conclude this press conference. There's a next one coming at 10 a.m. Thank you all for coming, and good day.